Okay, so we're going to go over the study guide. I'm going to go over the study guide. And uh, so number one, the quadratic function has a turning point at 5, -8. And here's the transformation that happens. Remember, if the +7 happens inside the parentheses, this is being left 7. And then the -3, that's down 3, because that's on the outside. Inside, remember, right and left switch. When you see it's a plus, it's left, and a minus, it's right. So if my turning point's at 5, -8, if I'm going left 7, 5, and if I go to the left 7, I should be at -2. And then -8, if I go down 3, I should be at -11. So my answer is -2, -11. Number 2, where does the absolute value of this have a turning point? This one actually doesn't have anything really much to do with transform. Actually, it kind of does have to do with transformations. Remember, the regular absolute value, as also with the regular parabola, has a turning point at 0, 0. And so if this is going right 8 and up 3, my answer should be 3. You could also think of this how the parabola and the absolute value, it kind of looks like vertex form from last chapter. So you could just use the opposite of the inside and whatever the outside is for your y value. Now, number three, what you have to do is you have to find an equation that transforms f into g. So f is this upside down parabola, and g is the, sorry, my bad. F is the one that opens up, and g is the one that opens down. So what is the transformation to get from the f to the g? Well, I know there's a reflection, right? And so if you look at the answer choices, the only one that is correct would be 2, because there's a reflection with the -1/2. But let's say that this wasn't multiple choice and you had to figure this out. Well, I know it reflects across the x-axis, so I know the negative has to be on the outside. And look what happens here. This f value, right? If I look at the y value here, I think I get -9 as my y value for the vertex. And then if I see for g, my y value is 4.5. So it gets cut in half, right? So that is compression of 2 by a factor of 2. Now, number 4, given that the function y is equal to x squared has intercepts at -9 and 3, where does the function this have x-intercepts? Now remember, if you are multiplying the x by 3, this is a horizontal compression. Okay. So that means we have to, instead of multiplying my x values by 3, I have to divide by 3. Okay. Remember, it's really multiplying by 1/3. Remember how it's on the inside, it's always the opposite. The 3 means it's a compression, so that means we have to divide by 3. If it was a 1/3, that would be a stretch, and we would multiply by 3. So if your x-intercepts are at -9 and 3, it's going to get changed by the horizontal compression. So I just divide each of these by 3. And so x is equal to -3, and x is equal to 1. My answer here is 4. Okay. Now let's go ahead and go to number 5, the next page. So if the point -3, 7 lies on the graph of f of x, which of these points must lie on here. So this is going to be a vertical stretch of 5. And then this is going to be down 20. So the vertical stretch in the down 20 only affects the y value. So all we do here is negative 3, 7. If I vertical stretch by 5, it's negative 3, 35. And then if I go down 20, it's now at negative 3, 15. Okay, so the answer here is 2. Number 6, the range of the function is negative 4 to 10. If this is my transformation, which of the following is the range for g of x? So remember here that this is going to be a reflection x-axis. How do you know it's the x-axis? Because the negative is on the outside. And remember, f of x stands for y. So if you're changing the sign of y, think of it graphically. You're going across the x-axis. And then you're going up 3. Okay. So that means my y value is switching signs. That's what reflecting across the x-axis means. The y value changes signs. And then we go up 3. So if this goes from negative 4 to 10, if I'm going to reflect this, then this means I'm now going from negative 10 to 4. Because I reflect across the x-axis, so that means you change the signs of both the negative 4 and the 10. And then now you're going to go up 3, so each of these y values will get moved up 3. So this would be negative 7 less than or equal to y less than or equal to 7. So that's 1. Number 7, which graph shows an even function? Remember, even functions are opposite x values have the same y values. If you think of it graphically, it's always the one that's symmetric across the y-axis. So it's 1. Okay. Remember, odd functions have symmetry across the origin. Opposite x values have opposite y values. And there's a question later that we'll get into the graphing that we could talk about. Okay, number 8. If f of x is an odd one-to-one function with 5 equals negative 2, then which point must lie on the graph of its inverse? Choose all that apply. Okay, so we have to choose all that apply. Now, you have to remember from last semester, inverse, all you do is you just switch the x and the y. However, they say here f of x is odd. So remember, if 5 outputs negative 2, then remember, if it's an odd function, opposite x values, so 5, negative 5, will output opposite y values. So f of negative 5 is equal to positive 2. Okay. And so my inverse, all I do is I switch the x and the y. So with the given, if I switch the x and the y here, it becomes negative 2, 5. So that's one of my answer choices. And then if I switch the x and the y here to get the inverse, it's 2, negative 5. That's another answer choice. So there are 2 answers there, 1 and 2. So number 9, for the function f of x, and it's defined by this formula, we have to describe the transformations. So there is a 2 attached to the x, so that's a horizontal. Now that's a horizontal compression, because remember, it's kind of reversed on the inside. If the number is bigger than 1, it's actually compression when it's on the inside. Review your transformation rules. So this is a horizontal compression. by a factor of 2. And then this is going to go down 3 units. Okay. Based on the fact that the point negative 12, 4 lies on f of x, what point must lie on g of x? Well, now we just apply the transformations to negative 12, 4. If we do a horizontal compression by a factor of 2, then that means negative 12, 4 now becomes negative 6, 4. And then we go down 3. My new point would be negative 6, 1. Number 10, the graph of the function is shown below. So now we have negative 2 f of x for all values of x. Produce the graph of g on the same grid. Okay, so I know here that the negative 2 on the outside means there's a reflection across the x-axis. And then the 2 means a vertical stretch by a factor of 2. Okay. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take the points and do the transformations here. So first thing, take each point. We're going to reflect across the x-axis and then stretch by a factor of 2. So let's look at this first point here, the one that's at negative 2, negative 7, negative 2, the one that's in red here. So if I'm going to reflect it across the x-axis, it's going to become at positive 2. But if we're going to stretch it to by a factor of 2, then it's going to become right here, negative 7, 4. So that's my first point. Then the point located at negative 2, 3, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this point, reflect it across. So it's going to become at negative 3, but we need to stretch it by a factor of 2, so it's going to become at negative 6. And so that's your other point right there. And then this one over here is going to become here. And then the one located at 5, negative 3 is now located at 5, positive 6. And now we just connect those points. Okay. And that's your graph. Now we're going to solve the equation. When does f of x equal g of x? Well, that's when they cross. So that's x equals negative 5. And also when x is equal to 3. Now, number 11, it says the function f of x is equal to x fourth minus 8 is either an even function or an odd function. Provide evidence to support your answer. Okay, so remember, even functions, opposite inputs have the same output. Odd functions, opposite inputs have opposite outputs. So the way we're going to do this is we just need to input opposite x values and see what we get as our answer. Okay. So what I'm going to do is let's try to do x is equal to 1. If I do that, I get 1 to the 4th minus 8 all over 4 times 1. And then that's 1 to the 4th is 1. 1 minus 8 is negative 7 over 4. Okay. Now let's try x is equal to -1. I get -1 to the fourth minus 8 all over 4 times -1. Okay, -1 to the fourth is +1. 1 minus 8 is -7. But on the bottom, 4 times -1 is -4. And remember, negative over negative just makes everything positive. So my answer here is 7/4. So if I plug in 1 and I get -7/4, and I plug in -1 and I get +7/4, that means the opposite x values have opposite y values. This is odd. Okay. If I got the same number, they would be even. Okay, number 12 is another graphing question. It is just like number 10. So if I have a function defined by 5 of f x over 2, don't be confused by the x over 2. Remember, dividing by 2 is the same thing as multiplying by 1/2. And if there's a 1/2 attached to the x on the inside, that's actually a horizontal stretch by a factor of 2. And then the 5 on the outside means there is a vertical stretch by a factor of 5. Okay. So that means each point is going to be multiplied by 5 in the x direction. I'm sorry, multiplied by 2 in the x direction, and then multiplied by 5 in the vertical direction. So, and what do I mean by that? Let me just take one point here. So for example, the point -5, -1, I multiply it by 2 in the x direction, and I multiply it by 5 in the vertical direction. So this would be -10, -5. Okay? And so that would be right here. Okay? And then now I just move on with each of the points. Once again, multiply the x value by 2. So if this is at -3, now it's at -6. And then I multiply it by 5. It's at 1, so it's at -6, 5. Okay? The one at -1 gets multiplied by 2 to become at -2. And then I'm going to bring it down here again. And this one, the one that's at 1, 1, multiplied by 1, multiplied by 2 to get to 2, multiply the y value by 5, and you're up here. This one will be right here. And then this one will be all the way out here. Okay, so that is the thing. By the way, on the test, you will be graphing transformations. Don't worry, it's a click and drag, so it's much easier than using a stylus that I'm using. But you will need to graph transformations. So don't just ignore this because you think it's gonna be an online test. You will have to graph transformations. Number 13. So remember, even functions, opposite x values have the same y value. So if this is half of an even function, the other half, so that means at -2, I'm at the same y value. at -7, I'm at the same y value. And then at -8, I'm also at the same y value as the right side. Okay, it should look better on your paper. But even functions, remember, the symmetry they have is they're symmetric across, let me type this out, across the y-axis. And then here, remember, odd functions now opposite x value. So at -2 is going to have the opposite y value. So -2, -4. Then at 7, -1 is now going to be at -7, +1. And then at 8, +2 is at 8, -2 now. And the symmetry that they have here is across the origin. Okay. Across the origin. Now, number 14. So once again, we just have to label the transformations here. Number 14, describe 3 transformations that would transform the graph x squared into this. So I have the x minus 8 on the inside, so that means it's going right 8. Actually, I'm going to type this out. Okay. Right 8 units. Okay. Then the minus on the outside means it is a reflection across the x-axis. And then now we go up 5 units. By the way, people are going to ask, how do I know the order? Well, one of the ways to think about the order is start with the x and then just start on the inside and then work your way out. So what I mean by that is the first thing that you see attached to the x is the -8. So I'm going to go right 8. Then after that, there's the minus sign just to the outside of it. So that's a reflection across the x-axis. And then up 5 units. Now, I won't mark you wrong if the first two are switched. Just remember the up and down always have to be last. Number 15. So we have to find the resulting quadratic if f of x, if this is my thing and it's reflected across the x-axis. Now remember, if you're reflecting across the x-axis, then that means you switch the signs of everything, okay? So it's going to be y is equal to 3x squared plus 3x minus 4. When you reflect across the y-axis, you're switching the signs of the x. So you only switch the signs of the x when you see it, when you see an x. So it's going to look like y is equal to -3. And then so what I'm doing is I'm just switching the signs of the x's only. Okay, and now we simplify it. Okay, it's going to become y is equal to -3x squared, because remember, the square just makes it positive. -3 times -x is going to make this plus 3x, and it's going to become plus 4. Okay. Okay, so number 15, that's how you do it. By the way, this study guide is much longer than the test. So there's some questions here that are not going to be on the test, or you could see that there's a lot of repetition, but for sure you'll see number 15 on the test. Number 16, you have to know stuff like 16 too. So a function g of x has a domain of -5 less than or equal to x less than or equal to 10, and a range of y is less than or equal to 15. If a new function is this, what is its domain and range? Well, let's talk about the transformations that happen here, right? I know that there's a reflection across the y-axis because the negative is attached to the x, right? I know there's a vertical stretch by a factor of 5. And then I also know that I am going at the very end up 3 units. Okay, now let's think about which ones affect the domain and which ones affect the range. Remember, whatever affects your x values will affect your domain. Whatever affects your y values will affect the range. So reflecting across the y-axis, think about it. If you think about it according grid, if I'm reflecting across the y-axis, the x value is changing. The vertical stretch by a factor of 5 affects the y, so that's going to affect the range, and up 3 affects the range. So the only one that affects the domain is the reflection across the y-axis, and basically, you're just going to switch the signs. So your new domain, okay, your new domain is going to be -10 less than or equal to x less than or equal to 5. Okay. Now, your range, however, gets affected by both the vertical stretch by a factor of 5 and you go up 3. So I'm going to multiply 15 times 5. Okay, and then that's 75. And then we're going to go up 3, and that's 78. So your new range is going to be y is less than or equal to 78. Okay. Okay. Now, this is extra practice. You should try this first on your own before, um, you know, looking at my solutions. Okay. So I'm actually going to go very quick through this because this is basically just understanding the transformations. So this one is going to be left 3, down 4. Your domain is going to be, so if I'm going left 3, that affects the x value. So this is going to be -7 is less than or equal to x less than or equal to -1. So I'm looking at this original domain here, and I'm going left 3. So that means -7 to -1. And then my range is going to be, so now I'm going down 4. So if I go down 4 here, it's -3 less than or equal to y less than or equal to 3. Oh, sorry. 2. Okay. Okay. Now, for transformations here, for the second one, it is just a vertical compression by a factor of 3. Your domain does not change. It stays exactly the same, and here's the reason why. A vertical compression by a factor of 3 only affects the y values. So I am just going to put the same thing for my domain here. Okay. Now, my range, though, will get changed. It's a vertical compression by a factor of 3. So that means I am going to divide everything here by 3. So this is 1/3 less than or equal to y less than or equal to 2. Whoops. Okay. So for letter C, the transformation, remember if it's the x is on the inside, this is a horizontal compression by a factor of 2. How is that going to change my domain? Well, that means I just divide my two domain numbers by 2. So my domain here is going to be -2 less than or equal to x less than or equal to 1. Okay. And then here, your range doesn't change. It is going to be 1 less than or equal to y less than or equal to 6, just because horizontal compression does not affect your y values. Your transformations for letter D. So the negative on the inside means there is a reflection across the y-axis. Okay, and also there is going to be a vertical stretch by a factor of 4. So your domain here, the one that gets affected is the reflection across the y-axis. So now that just means you switch the signs. So this is going to be -2 is less than or equal to x less than or equal to +4. Because right here, the -4 becomes 4 and the 2 becomes -2, but the negative is always going to be less. So that's why I have to put it first. And then the range, a vertical stretch by a factor of 4 just means that I multiply my y values by 4. So it's 4 less than or equal to y less than or equal to 24. Letter E, your transformations here. So the 1/4 on the inside means there is going to be a horizontal stretch by a factor of 4. And then the negative on the outside means there is a reflection across the x-axis. So your domain will get affected by the horizontal stretch by a factor of 4. So if your domain goes from -4 to 2, I multiply everything by 4. It's -16 is less than or equal to x less than or equal to 8. And then your range, if it's a reflection across the x-axis, then that means you just switch the signs of your y values. So this is going to be -6 is less than or equal to y less than or equal to -1. For letter F, there are 3 transformations here. So you are going right 5 units, vertical stretch by a factor of 3, and then you're going to go up 10 units. So once again, which ones affect your domain? Well, it's the only ones that go left, right, or horizontal compression stretch. So it's only the right 5 which affects my domain. So your new domain should be, I'm going right 5, so it will be 1 less than or equal to x less than or equal to 7. My range, if I'm doing a vertical stretch by 3 and then up 10. Okay, so let's think about this. So if my original range starts at 1, if I do a vertical stretch by 3, 1 times 3 is 3, and then I go up 10, so now I'm at 13. Okay? And then now, if my original range ends at 6, I stretch it by 3, that's 18, and I go up 10, it's going to be 28. So that's my new range. So for letter G, if I have the divided by 3 on the inside, remember that's the same thing as 1/3. So that means here I have a horizontal stretch by a factor of 3. And then I am also going to go down 4 units. So my domain will get stretched by a factor of 3. So I multiply the domain by 3. So it's going to be negative 12. Negative 12 less than or equal to x, less than or equal to 6. And in the range, if I'm going down 4 units, it's going to be at negative 3 and 2. Okay. Now letter H, the last one. So my transformations here is there is a reflection across the y-axis. There is also a reflection across the x-axis. Because remember, the one on the inside with the x is across the y. The one on the outside is a reflection across the x. And the 1/2 means there is a vertical compression by a factor of 2. Okay, so which one of these affects the domain? Well, reflecting across the y-axis affects the domain. Okay, so then that means we switch the signs of my domain. So the 2 becomes negative, the 4 becomes positive, but then we need to switch because negative 2 is less than 4. So it is going to be negative 2 is less than or equal to x, less than or equal to 4. Okay. Now my range, be careful here. There's 2 steps to this. So there's a reflection across the x-axis. So that means I'm going to switch my signs. 6 is going to become negative 6 and 1 is going to become negative 1. But I also have to compress them by a factor of 2. So then that means the negative 6 is going to become negative 3 because I divide by 2. And the negative 1 is going to become negative 1/2. So this is going to be negative 6 less than or equal to y less than or equal to negative 1/2. Okay. So please email me if you have any questions. You could watch this video over and over until you get it. But I'll give you more information on the test time, but it's going to be on Wednesday. Okay.